Hi everyone, welcome to Count Me In, supporting students in your class with math difficulty. My name is Terry Marks. I work at the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I'm a senior researcher here at the American Institute for Research, and I work alongside the center and many of our consultants for professional learning related to intensive intervention. Today's webinar is going to focus specifically on math concepts, and we are excited that Dr. Sarah Powell, who's an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, is here with us to share about a new set of online course content that we have available that is definitely applicable no matter what your role in the field. Next slide, please. So just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We do encourage questions throughout the presentation. So if you can look off to kind of the right side or wherever your kind of toolbar is, you'll see a part that says questions. If you submit a question there, we will be able to see that question. I will be pausing throughout the presentation and asking some probing questions for Sarah. And some of those questions will be questions that were submitted prior to this webinar from folks that had questions, as well as any questions that you submit during the actual webinar. We will be leaving time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but we do encourage questions throughout, just in the event that we start to run short. Next slide. So just a quick overview for today's webinar. We are going to be providing an overview of the mathematics course content. And that will include an in-depth description of the content within each module so that you understand exactly the concepts that are being covered. We'll also review other resources that are available, and then, as mentioned, we'll spend some time on questions and answers. So please make sure that you are sending those in. Next slide. And this is where you'll be able to find the content. So the URL is at the top of the page. We've also included that in the chat box for you all. So if you want to go ahead and link to the material, you can do so there. The website looks like that. It just shows kind of an introductory text around what you'll be able to kind of see in that content. And then down below, there are interactive blocks with the module that link directly to the modules that Dr. Sarah Powell is going to be talking us through today. So I think next slide. That being said, I am going to now turn over this portion of the webinar to Dr. Sarah Powell, who's going to provide an overview of the course. You'll be hearing me throughout as I ask specific questions coming through and/or that were submitted prior to the start of this webinar. So Sarah, I'll go ahead and turn it over.
All right, thank you so much, Terry. Hello to all. Super excited for you to join us this afternoon. For those of you that have started school, hope it's going well so far. And for those of you that get to start next week, best of luck to your beginning of your school year. And hopefully all of the information we talk about here today is going to be really helpful to you as you plan your instruction this year for students with math learning difficulty. So over the past 2 years, I have worked with the National Center for Intensive Intervention and the University of Connecticut to develop a series of 8 math modules related to intensive intervention in the area of mathematics. And so each of these modules is listed here, and our webinar today is going to talk through what you can learn from these modules and what you can use in these modules to inform your intensive intervention for students that struggle in different areas of math. So as part of this, what we call the math course, there are 8 modules. And so the 8 modules are listed here. And I'll go ahead and provide a brief overview of these right now, and then I will get into some better detail with these as we go through this webinar. So the first module is really an introduction to intensive intervention in the area of math, and thinking about how do you figure out the good and important math content that we need to include in math intensive intervention. Module 2 is an assessment module, so thinking about screening within intensive intervention, as well as progress monitoring and diagnostics. Modules 3, 4, and 5 deal with the choosing of the interventions that you are going to use with your students in intensive intervention. And then 4 and 5 specifically think about, well, how do you deliver that instruction and what are some of the strategies that should be embedded within that instruction. And then modules 6 and 7 are really about content knowledge for you, the teacher. So to better your background knowledge related to whole number content or rational number content. And then module 8 is putting all of this together. So in module 8, we focus on fidelity of implementation, as well as adaptations to intensive intervention, and how all of this fits together so that you can provide a really strong intensive intervention package for students that need it. Next slide, please. So within each of these modules, we have developed really 5 main parts that are all guided by video. And that's one of the really neat things about this course is that we have recorded all of the content for you. I have done most of the recording, so you have to see my face a lot. But we've put this on the NCI website and linked to YouTube so that you can watch this instruction, you know, before you teach something the next day or over the weekend as you are prepping your intensive intervention for different students. So within each module, you will see a video introduction, and then there will be 3 parts to every module. And each of those 3 parts include different content that's important for that module. And I'm going to talk through each of the parts of all the modules on the subsequent slides. And then there's always a closing video to kind of say, like, here's what we learned, and here's how this is going to be applied in your classroom as you work with students. And then also you'll see at the end of each module, there's a coaching guide. So that would be good for you, the teachers, if you want to reflect on what you are doing in the classroom with your students. Or that would be also good for math specialists or other district personnel who are acting as coaches of teachers who are implementing intensive intervention. Next slide. So what I thought it would be helpful to do is to kind of show you how all of this is set up. So for example, as you access each module, and you will find each part within a module. So this is from, I think, module 1. This is part 3 of module 1. So you can see right immediately there's a video, all right? So this video, you can just play it, and it's going to introduce you to all the content that's important for part 3 of module 1. But then as you work through the video, there might be different activities that we ask you to pause and do. And so all of those activities are listed down here. You can kind of see them on the bottom of this page. So for example, here, part 3 of this module has activities number 5 and 6. So these are the Word versions of each activities. Sometimes they might be a PDF, but you can either, you know, download them to your computer and do them on your computer, or print them off and do those activities on your own. The idea here is that as you work through this module, you are not just watching a video, but you're actually an active participant and learning alongside the video series. And then one of the other things that we've done with all these modules is that many times we have related videos. And you might be really interested in showing these to some other teachers. You might be interested in watching them again. And so we have pulled out all of the video examples in which we have tutors working with students so that you can easily find those. So down here at the very bottom of the page, you can see there's a video example where a tutor is working on adding fractions with unlike denominators. So if you really wanted to kind of dig deep into that specific video, we have taken it out and put it on the slide so it's easy for you to find. Because it's not slides, it's the web page, so it's easy for you to find. Next slide. So now I would like to talk about the content of each of the 8 modules. So we will start with module 1. The title of module
Sarah?
1 is developing a, yes, Terry.
Oh, can I pause you for just 1 second? Because we did have a question that came in beforehand, and I think this would be a good place to kind of break up. The question was, how do you support students who are significantly below grade level? So if we're thinking about this content and intensive mathematics intervention, do you feel as though the content that's in this course and in these modules is relevant for students who are below grade level?
I do, Terry. And in fact, when we developed this course, we thought a lot about this very question of, you know, what do we do with students that might be in 7th grade but are performing around a 2nd or 3rd grade level? And that's where intensive intervention comes into play. Intensive intervention would be important for a 7th grader who's struggling a little bit, but it also is essential for a student who is struggling a lot. And this module that we're about to talk about is a really important one because and this is why we talk about it first. Before I ever start teaching a student that has math learning difficulty, I need to figure out what's the content that we should be teaching. And a lot of times teachers just kind of teach like, oh, this is what, my curriculum says that I need to teach. But if we're doing intensive intervention with students, we need to pick that apart and we need to figure out where does the student have strengths and weaknesses and develop an individualized scope and sequence for those students. So in that way, if you do have a student that's performing significantly below grade level, we can go back and say, all right, we need to pick up some of this second grade material, some of this fourth grade material, and we're going to individualize that scope and sequence so that when we start teaching, so that's going to be like the next thing we think about, that content is applicable to that student. All right, so I'll go ahead and talk through, you're welcome. I'll talk through Module 1 here. So Module 1 is about developing a scope and sequence. As you look at the NCII website for each of these modules, you will always have this brief paragraph that's like, here's what this module is about. And then there will always be 3 bullet points, and each of those bullet points address each of the parts of the module. So like I said before, there are 3 parts to every module. So for Module 1, the first part is about the necessity for providing intensive intervention. The second part is what are the foundational math skills necessary for math competence. And then the third part of this module would be sequencing the math content for students in intensive intervention. Next slide. So for the introduction for Module 1, so that's me, if you don't know what we look like, and I know all of these screenshots make me look super goofy, but I'm okay with that because this is important math work that teachers need to address. But this is a brief video. Usually these are only 2 to 5 minutes where they will just provide an overview of what's in this module. So I would suggest watching that so you get an idea of what is the content in Module 1 that might be applicable to me. Next slide. In part 1 of Module 1, we talk about the need for intensive intervention. And in this framework, or in this part, we introduce the NCII, here it says DBI framework, that's the Database Individualization Framework, and that's introduced in this video. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about this framework. So hopefully most of you have seen this framework presented before. So this is about intensive intervention. So for any strong intensive intervention program, whether we're thinking about math or maybe we're thinking about reading or writing or behavior, we want to have a validated intervention program in place. And so in these parts of these different modules, I'm going to highlight what does a really strong validated intervention program look like. But then we can never do intervention without progress monitoring. That's the first green oval that you see here on this slide. And then if students are responsive, we're going to keep doing this intervention program with the progress monitoring. But when students are non-responsive, then we want to conduct a diagnostic, adapt the intervention, and continue to progress monitor. And so on the videos that you see associated with this math course, you are likely to see this picture of the intensive intervention framework probably at least 100 times throughout the 8 different modules. So we use this framework to basically frame all of the work that we present in Module 1 and all subsequent modules. Next slide. So in Module 1, Part 2, then we talk about, well, what math content is important for students to learn and to master. And this gets to your question, Terry, about students who are significantly below grade level. So here I present some ideas about looking at what we call the pathways of standards, or maybe the continuum of math learning. So what is the continuum of math learning for students related to fact fluency? What is the continuum of learning related to place value? What is the continuum of learning related to geometry? So we look at those individually, and then we talk about, well, how do we put these different standards along one continuum of math learning to really be the math content that students need to work on within their intensive intervention. So the video gives a lot of good examples of those different continuum of math learning. And then there's some different activities where you, the teacher, can practice putting operation standards in orders or problem solving standards in order. And then once you do that, how does that help you identify skill gaps that a student really needs to focus on within intensive intervention? Next slide. Then part 3 is then, well, what content is absolutely essential? So we kind of expand upon part 2 of module 1 here with part 3, and we start to talk about bringing in some of the assessment data to really say, okay, this student needs to really focus on problem solving, this student needs to focus on pre-algebraic readiness, and this student needs to focus on initial fraction understanding. So the activities here are really helping you think through, if you have a student or students that really require math intensive intervention, what are some of the ways that you can think through designing that student's instruction? Next slide. So then at the end of module 1, as I said, we have these with all of the modules, but you will find a coaching or facilitator guide. This is most helpful for people that are going to be doing coaching in schools. But I think anyone implementing intensive intervention might like to at least look through the coaching guide to see what is expected of teachers for full implementation of intensive intervention in module 1. Next slide. So now we move to module 2, and I know with some of the questions that came in before this webinar started, some people were asking about diagnostics and progress monitoring measures, and so this is going to be the module that you want to dig deep into. So when I think about module 2, I think about it as the assessment module, which is why I wrote this on this slide here. But this is really all of the important assessment practices that need to be in play as we are implementing intensive intervention. Next slide. So part 1 of module 2 is talking about what are the different types of assessments. So we focus on 3 different types of assessments within intensive intervention. We focus on diagnostic assessments and the role of those. We focus on formative assessments and focus on those quite a bit. And then we also mention summative assessments because many students are working toward completing a summative assessment at the end of their school year. So this is really just an overview of the different types of assessments that you might possibly use within intensive intervention or data-based individualization. Next slide. Part 2 of this is really digging deep into progress monitoring. Diagnostic assessments are important to use to really understand the strengths and weaknesses profile of students. But if we want to know if students are responsive within intensive intervention, it is essential that we use progress monitoring measures. So this entire part of this module, so part 2 of module 2, is about progress monitoring. We focus on early numeracy progress monitoring measures. We focus on computation progress monitoring measures, and we focus on applications progress monitoring measures. Those are the pretty common measures that we see across grades K through 8. Also within this module, we mentioned some of the other progress monitoring measures that are available out there. There are some that are available in geometry and measurement. There are some related to algebra, but we really focus on the ones that we see school teachers using the most in schools. And one really nice activity that ties in well with the National Center for Intensive Intervention is activity number 7. So it's how to navigate the NCII tools chart to figure out which progress monitoring measures we should be using in the area of math. Next slide. Then module 2 also has these really cool videos. So most of these are for the early numeracy measures, but perhaps you've never seen an early numeracy measure administered. So we actually made a video of a tutor administering each of these different videos to a student. And then let's say you want to practice giving one of these measures and scoring it before you go and do this with your own students. So these bottom 3 examples here, you will see we have videoed a student taking the number identification measure, and then that goes with the different activities where you have the score sheet in front of you and you can actually score it alongside the video. So this is really nice to give you, the teacher, practice with administration and scoring of these measures before doing it in front of your actual students. Next slide. And then part 3 of module 2 is, well, what do we do with these scores, right? So I collect all this data and you're kind of like, well, Sarah, what do we do next? So here we focus on how to set goals for students and then how to recognize whether students are on track or off track to meet those goals. A lot of this comes from some of the other work the National Center for Intensive Intervention has done in terms of looking at benchmarks or looking at slopes or looking at an intra-individual framework for understanding how to set goals and monitor those goals. And there's some really nice activities here where you can connect data for some of the students that we present you with to see how that can inform instructional decision making. But then also let's look at your students' data, and then how are you going to design an intervention platform that's reflective for that student. So really trying to give you some activities as the teacher that are going to help you really focus on the students that need the most intensive intervention, and how can you use your data to guide the decisions you make within intensive intervention. So that's module 2. Remember, that's the assessment module. Are there any questions or any other things that we need to talk about in terms of assessment?
There was one question that was submitted in advance, and I know that you just talked about both progress monitoring and using those data to help inform instructional decisions. But do you have any tips for the actual analysis of those data? Are there strategies that you would suggest as folks progress monitor their students? How will they know where to target intervention?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So there is a resource, and I'm going to hope that the amazing NCII team places this up there. The NCII has developed its own data platform, which is housed within an Excel spreadsheet that was developed by Dr. Devin Kearns at the University of Connecticut. He developed it in the area of reading, but it works just as well in the area of math. But you can actually enter students' scores into this Excel spreadsheet, and then it graphs those scores so that you can, and it gives you an idea whether students are on track to meet benchmark goals or slope goals. And so that's a really nice resource that's already available. I see Amy just put it up there on the chat box. So thank you, Amy. So that's a good place to start. Also, any good progress monitoring measure should have benchmarks or typical rate of growth, what we would call slope data associated with it. So if you are looking at progress monitoring measures from different companies, they should be like, well, what is the typical expectation for a 4th grader taking a computation measure? Or what is the typical rate of growth that we should see from week to week for a 7th grader using an applications measure? And so that data should really help you say, like, okay, I expect that a student is growing, 1 digit per week, but let's say your student is not making that kind of growth. So then that helps with your decision-making process. Are there any other questions about assessment?
Not about assessment, but I'm wondering, I'm going to go ahead and just share with you one of the questions that came in, and not that you have to provide an answer right now, but maybe as you're talking through kind of next sections to be thinking about. So the question that came in was how interventions can be provided in Tier 1, as well as anything that we should be doing in Tiers 2 and Tier 3. So I know that you're kind of moving into some of the evidence-based practice portion, so I wasn't sure if you could maybe highlight where you think some of the connections can be made to core instruction, as well as where we think things might have to rest within Tier 2 or Tier 3.
Well, Terry, we are heading into the territory that's going to be really important for the person that asked this question. So in modules 3, 4, and 5, we're going to talk a lot about how to deliver instruction and what that instruction should look like. And especially modules 4 and 5, we are going to talk about how to use explicit instruction, how to use schema-based word problem instruction. And those are things that aren't just really good Tier 2, Tier 3 intensive intervention practices. Those are things that also have a strong research base in the Tier 1 classroom. And so while we designed this math course here to be focused on those students that are experiencing difficulty with math and not meeting their grade level benchmarks in math, almost all of these practices, these aren't exclusive to special education or intensive intervention. These are practices that are good math practices. So I hope that will help the person that asked that question, at least get them started there. And then I'm always happy to follow up to provide more detail about what we would like to see in Tier 1. All right, so Module 3. Now we shift from Module 1 kind of set us up. Module 2 starts to talk about the assessments that are necessary to use within intensive intervention. And then Module 3 gets us to start thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to teach these things? So we've got the scope and sequence established, and we've got the assessments in place. So module 3 really is about this whole idea of evidence-based practices, which we all know that term and we've heard it pretty regularly, but what does that mean? And so we talk about, well, there's different forms of evidence-based practices. And so we really focus on evidence-based interventions and what's the difference between an evidence-based intervention and an evidence-based strategy. So we talk about these different forms of evidence and why they're both important. It's important to pull in both evidence-based interventions and evidence-based strategies to inform your instructional platform within intensive intervention. Next slide. So then part 2 of this module then says, okay, well, we need to use these evidence-based practices, so where do we find them? This brings us back to the NCII website and the tools chart, this time the academic tools chart instead of the progress monitoring tools chart. And I kind of overview, what should we be looking for? And so actually this slide has it behind my body there that's on the slide, but we need assessment data that shows results. We need to make sure that these things have been replicated, and we need to make sure that the data have occurred where in settings and with students that are similar to your own. So really being like a thoughtful consumer of these evidence-based practices when we want to start to build the instructional platform. Next slide. And then part 3 is, well, then how do we make an instructional platform? So this is really the jumping off point for implementing intensive intervention. And so we take these ideas about evidence-based interventions and evidence-based strategies, and we think about the content that needs to be taught and then how we're going to progress monitor that content. And then this is put together, that's going to be the very top of that NCII's, the DBI framework. That's what we call the instructional platform. And this is going to like put all of that together. So activity number 6 here is an excellent activity to do at the teacher level. So you've got a student and here's what their data says, that where they need work. You have figured out the content that you need to teach. And so now how are you going to put together a collection of interventions or strategies to then teach that content to that student? So all of the stuff that we've accrued, all of the knowledge that we've accrued across modules 1, 2, and 3 lead us here to the instructional platform and the development of that instructional platform. Next slide. So then as we head into modules 4 and 5, we've got that instructional platform. And so module 4 is about how you deliver the platform. And module 5 is strategies that should be embedded within that instructional platform. And so this is, I think modules 4 and 5, even though they're separate, they kind of co-occur. If you're working through module 4, I would hope that you would also work through module 5 as well. And they, as I say at the bottom of the slide, they provide this really nice overview of what should be in a strong instructional platform. Next slide. So part 1 of module 4, this is all about delivery of instruction. And when we think about intensive intervention, we can't think about intensive intervention without explicit instruction. And so this part is, how do you use explicit instruction in the area of math within intensive intervention? And so this is, I would say, really essential information that every teacher needs to watch and work through. We use the same framework about explicit instruction as the explicit instruction course that's also available from NCII. And as you see kind of on this video snapshot, my colleague at the University of Connecticut, Devin Kearns, who's a really strong expert in the area of explicit instruction, he actually pops up and helps us introduce this set of slides. So if you're familiar with Devin's work, you will see him on the slides along with me. And if you go to the next slide, I will show you, this is not within the math course, but the NCII has also an explicit instruction course. And there's a screenshot from that. If you follow this web address, found if you just Google NCII explicit instruction, it's the first hit that comes up. But Devin and his colleagues have put together 4 modules that really dig deep into explicit instruction. And some of these have math examples, some of them have reading examples, some of these are writing examples, but we take the framework that's presented by Devin and his colleagues in this explicit instruction course, and then we apply it specifically to mathematics. So part 1 of module 4 is the explicit instruction module of how to do explicit instruction within math intervention. Next slide.
So Sarah, real quick, we did have a question that came in that asked if there were prerequisite skills that educators would need to effectively provide. So do you think that that this explicit instruction content is that prerequisite?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say it's one of the prerequisites. So when teaching math, you have to balance two things. One is you have to balance your pedagogical knowledge. So like, how do you teach? And really, if we are teaching any learner who is struggling with anything, we need to think about going to explicit instruction and making sure that that is amazing. Because the research base around explicit instruction, that's really like the strongest foundation of research that we have in anything related to special education. So I would say in terms of prerequisite skills, do you know what explicit instruction is? Do you know how to model? Do you know how to design effective practice opportunities? And then do you know how to engage students within explicit instruction? That's all about asking good questions, providing strong feedback, being very planned and organized with your learning. And what I just talked about there is what's in modules 5, 6, and 7 of the explicit instruction course. So that would be a really important prerequisite knowledge. In the same way, you can't be a good math teacher without understanding math content. So being a really amazing math teacher is that pedagogical knowledge and understanding the math content. And in our math course, modules 6 and 7 are really designed for teachers to improve their knowledge related to whole numbers and rational numbers. And so I think it's a nice combination, but if we are thinking about prerequisite skills, I would really suggest starting with the explicit instruction course and then deep diving into the math course that NCII developed. Next question. So so this is in module 4, this is part 1. Remember how I said a little earlier, we've got lots of video examples of a tutor working with a student. Here's a set of 7 different videos where you can see like, well, what does explicit instruction look like, Sarah, if you were asking that question. And a lot of our examples are from elementary grades and a lot of our examples are from middle school. So you can actually see like using algebra tiles to solve an equation. So we have kind of a representative sample of what we would think would occur in terms of explicit instruction across grades K through 8. Next slide. So part 2 of module 4 gets into this idea of using multiple representations. So as we deliver instruction and we use our best explicit instruction, we also need to bring in ways for students to see and interact with math in different ways. And that's where multiple representations come into play. Multiple representations, a lot of you probably think about these as like the concrete representation, representational and abstract, or the CRA. So we talk about the need for concrete materials, the need for virtual manipulatives, the need for pictorial representations, so that then students really understand what the abstract of mathematics means. Next slide. And then part 2 here has some video examples. So here we can see using different concrete manipulatives and pictorial representations, as well as emphasizing the abstract. So you can kind of see how all of those build to bring in a nice picture of multiple representations for a student. Next slide. And then part 3 of module 4 is the focus on mathematical language. So the mathematical language that we use for students is really essential because, as I've read it before, in math, every student is a language learner. Like, we are all learning the language of math. And so we have to provide explicit instruction about the vocabulary and the terms that we are using within intensive intervention, because students write in mathematics, they read in mathematics, they listen in mathematics, and they speak in mathematics. And so we have to pay attention to this language so that students can engage in math learning fully. And I'm not calling my articles out exactly, but I worked with my colleagues Elizabeth Hughes and Elizabeth Stevens, and we wrote 2 articles that are both in Teaching Exceptional Children about how to pay better attention to your math language at the elementary level and at the middle school level. And so our activities that are presented here, Activity 8 and Activity 9, go along with those articles. So I think those are good reads if you think you want to beef up the math language that you're providing to students. So in Module 4, it's all about how to, I'm sorry, what is it?
Sorry, I was going to say two questions kind of around this area. So one of the questions that we received in advance that I think kind of connects with some of what you were just talking about, but it's specifically around supporting students with math, supporting their math development for children with language disorders. So if we know that, that we're working with a student that already has a language disorder, what recommendations would you have within mathematics instruction to support them?
Yeah, so kind of going back to what we just talked about, explicit vocabulary instruction is really essential. In like first and second grade, we see that students kind of in their math world need to know between 100 and 200 different terms. By third grade, that jumps up to over 300. And by middle school, students are kind of responsible for knowing 400 to 500 different terms and probably more in math. And so actually explicitly teaching the language that we are using. So, you know, that might be pulling in some language arts strategies, that might be having different word walls or different math journals and, you know, vocabulary exercises. There's also a lot of technology that will help you practice math vocabulary, but being explicit with this idea that students are language learners in math. And then beyond that, whenever you're doing anything in math, we have a lot of students in many of our projects that have reading difficulty and writing difficulty. So providing the same supports that you would in perhaps like reading class, you also bring those into math class. So reading things aloud, reading things with the student, but making sure that students are having an opportunity to read in math, to write in math, and then to speak in math. So they're speaking with you, they're like using these formal terms. And if people are really interested in this, I have more resources that I can get into at another time. But paying attention to it is the first thing that we need to think about. Was there another question, Terry?
No, I think we can move forward. There's one that I think I'm hoping that we can get through some of the other content in the modules and then perhaps hold off the question that came in.
Perfect. Okay. So Module 4 is about how you deliver the instructional platform that you have developed. Module 5 gets into 3 things that the research shows are important to embed within your intensive intervention. So those 3 things are the following. Next slide. In part 1, we talk about building fact fluency. So I really have not met many students that struggle with math that don't also struggle with fact fluency. So here we talk about strategies for building fact fluency, but that's something that needs to occur every day within your intensive intervention session. So we get into that in part 1. We talk about many different strategies to help build fact fluency. It doesn't have to just be a worksheet, but part 1 pays attention to the necessity for a fact fluency building activity to be embedded within your intensive intervention. Next slide. Part 2 is probably one of my favorite things to think about, if you know me, is about word problem instruction. Because we ask students to show their math competency through word problem solving, if you are not providing good problem solving instruction every time you do intensive intervention, you're doing your students a disservice. Because we can't just do problem solving activities on Friday. We can't just leave it for 2 weeks before any high stakes tests that students are going to take. And so again, it's something that needs to be embedded within your intensive intervention. And so we focus on schema-based word problem solving. As the research says, that's the most effective approach. This is a long module. I think it comes in over an hour, but we go through all 6 schemas that we see across grades K through 8. And we talk about these different schemas, and there's activities where you can identify the different schemas in additive problems and multiplicative problems. But I think this is a very good overview of what does effective problem solving strategies, what do those look like when they're presented within intensive intervention. And then module, part 3 of this module, because I just said we had an hour-long video about word problem solving, part 3 has a very brief video about motivational strategies. So that's like the 3rd strategy that should be embedded within any intensive intervention session. That's something to motivate the students to participate in the lesson, to be actively involved. And so we talk about some different motivational components, and this is pretty brief, but also very important. So by the end of Module 5, you have thought about the delivery of instruction, and then 3 strategies that should be embedded within your daily teaching with intensive intervention, and those are building fluency, effective problem-solving instruction, and a good motivational component. Next slide. So then as we head to Module 6, Modules 6 and 7 are really to help increase teacher knowledge about whole number content and rational number content. We realize that there's a lot more math content out there than just whole numbers and rational numbers, but those are essential. They are the foundation to everything that students will do later in mathematics. So we developed these 2 modules to really increase teacher knowledge around math content. So I'll go through these kind of quickly. So Module 6 focuses on whole numbers. Part 1 of Module 6 really gets into the concepts of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So we talk about the different ways to think about adding. There's 2 concepts of subtraction, the same thing with multiplication and division. This is really nicely tied to the schema instruction in Part 2 of Module 5. But this is all about conceptual understanding of the 4 operations. So if you as a teacher kind of like, yeah, you know, I'm not sure what Sarah's talking about when she says there's 2 ways to think about subtracting, this would be a really important module for you to watch to increase your knowledge about whole number content. Next slide. So part 1 of this module talks about concepts. So then part 2 talks about procedures. So here we get into some of the different algorithms that are out there to add, subtract, multiply, and divide whole numbers. There's a use of alternate algorithms that might be important for you to pull in, especially for students that have been practicing long division one way for 4 years and it hasn't clicked yet. Let's try another way. So this is getting into the procedures of whole numbers that are important to emphasize with students. And next slide. So then part 3 of Module 6 is like, well, what does this look like? So we actually have some examples where tutors are working with students. The video examples there are, you can see posted at the bottom if you just want to watch those. But as we watch these, I actually go through and say, look how this tutor did explicit instruction. Look how she modeled. Look at these multiple representations. Look at these counters that she's pulling in. That's hitting the multiple representations piece. And then I also always say, like, well, look at that language that she's using. This is how we're attending to clear and concise math language. Next slide. So Module 7 is somewhat repetitive to Module 6, but instead of whole number content, it's rational number content. Next slide. So part 1 of Module 7 is everything you've ever wanted to know about the 3 models of fractions. That's the length model, the area model, and the set model of fractions, and the concepts that should be emphasized so that students really understand what a fraction represents. Part 2, if we go to the next slide, then focuses on rational number procedures. So this gets into the procedures for how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. We get into a lot of representational models about how to help students understand what does it mean to multiply fractions and divide fractions. I think that that might be really helpful to a lot of teachers. And then next slide. Part 3 then puts this all together. So what does this look like? So here we can see a tutor and a student working together. On this slide, I'm actually making note of all of the vocabulary that they use during the session. So how is that vocabulary used? How is it taught? And how is it emphasized by the tutor? Next slide. So then we come back to more like pedagogical skills with Module 8. So this is the module that puts all of these things together, but there are a few new things in Module 8 that are really essential for intensive intervention. Next slide. So part 1 of Module 8 is, well, how do we do this with fidelity? So if we choose an evidence-based intervention or an evidence-based strategy, we need to make sure that we're doing that to the greatest extent that we can possibly do that. So we look at different fidelity checklists. We look at that qualitative components related to fidelity. But this is really like, well, how do we implement this as it is meant to be implemented? Then part 2 is a really important part of Module 8 and the intensive intervention process. And this is making adaptations within intensive intervention. So we focus on 6 adaptations that are really essential to make probably not all at one time, but these are important to make when students are not making adequate progress with your intensive intervention. So the adaptations that we talk about are implementing with greater fidelity, embedding behavioral supports, and increasing the dosage. Those three are kind of like your initial set of adaptations. Those are usually pretty easy adaptations to put into play. The fourth adaptation has at least 30 to 40 different working components, but that's adapting math content. So how can you adapt math content to be much more responsive to a student's needs? The fifth adaptation that we talk about is how do we do better with our explicit instruction? And then the sixth adaptation we talk about is how do we explicitly teach students to transfer math knowledge from one type of math content to another. So those are the 6 adaptations that we break down in this video that you can see. And so that it really gives you a good idea of, well, if this is not good enough, what are some of the things that I can do to make it better so that my student does start to become responsive to the intensive intervention instead of showing no or stagnant growth. Next slide. And then finally, part 3 of Module 8 is the last one. It really puts this all together. I kind of made a note over here that this might be one of the things to watch first. It really tries to review all of the 8 modules and put it all together. And so it's a brief overview, but it really gets into the idea of what are you going to see across the 8 modules, and how does all of this stuff that we've talked about, how does it fit within an intensive intervention framework in math for students that have learning difficulties. Next slide. So I'll finish up here. So those were our 8 modules. Remember, Module 1 is scope and sequence. Module 2, assessment. Module 3 is finding evidence-based practices. Then Module 4 and 5 are delivery of those evidence-based practices. Module 6 and 7 are increasing your teacher knowledge. And then Module 8 puts it all together. Next slide. So there are a few other resources also available throughout the math course. Let me show these to you, and then we will answer some questions. So there's a course overview that we have provided on the website. Here you can see this is the course overview for parts 1, 2, and 3 of Module 1. But if you're kind of looking for some like very specific stuff within a module, you can read this overview to say like, oh, there it is. I want to know what foundational math is important across grade levels. Then you can go to part 2 of Module 1, and that information will be there for you. Next slide. If you are interested in figuring out, well, how did we address the CEC standards within each of our modules, there is a spreadsheet for you that looks exactly like this, where you can see how we think we addressed different standards within part 1, part 2, part 3 of each of the 8 modules. Next slide, please. We also have some suggested readings. So I know this is one of the questions of like, well, how can I learn more about this? And so we put together some of our favorite, very teacher-friendly articles. So most of these are in Teaching Exceptional Children, or their practice articles in Learning Disabilities Research and Practice. But we have the links to all of these articles if you want to learn more about math language, or more about intensive intervention, or more about schema-based word problem instruction. So for every module, we've listed anywhere from 4 to, I think, 6 or 7 different readings. They are not mandatory, but they might be really nice to increase your knowledge around these different topics. And then finally, we have some example lessons along with a lot of different videos that show how to use manipulatives in these 6 areas that are placed here on this slide. So if you want more information about place value, or you want more practice activities related to computation of fractions, the NCII has prepared these really nice teacher-friendly booklets, and then there are videos that accompany almost all of the examples within these booklets, so that you can use some of this to increase your intensive intervention practices with your students. Next slide. And then finally, this is a project that I'm working on. This is an OSEP funded project. This is specifically for middle school, but a lot of these things apply for elementary students as well. This is our project STAIR, which is trying to get students to be ready for algebra in 8th or 9th grade. And we've made an entire set of middle school specific videos related to math practices. And right now we have about 100 videos on our Project STAIR website. We have a YouTube channel that you can find, or if you want, I can send you the link, where if you want even a deeper dive into some of this math content, specifically for middle school students, our Project STAIR resources would be a good reach out at that point. Next slide. So finally, we come to the time where we have questions. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I'll go ahead and let Terry be the moderator to ask the questions, and then we can discuss the responses to these questions.
Absolutely. First of all, Sarah, thank you so much. This is wonderful information. We've already had some people kind of chiming in and saying that they feel that the resources are really great.
Good. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, you did a lot of really great work, and we are happy that it is a part of the
It took a while, so we're glad that people can start to use these materials.
Definitely. So we did have one question that came in during the presentation that was around high school teachers and courses. So are there suggestions that you have for either students with intensive needs within the high school setting, and or any additional things that, tips or things for high school teachers, maybe following some of the course content guidelines, even though a lot of what we are focused on is at the elementary and middle school level? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. One of the things when we developed this course, we somewhat had to focus on some specific grade bands. And so we focused on grades K through 8. That is not to mean that most, if not all, of the material that we talk about is not appropriate for high school students. For a lot, in my experience, there's not always a huge difference from what a 9th grader with IEP goals in math needs versus a 7th grader with IEP goals in math. And so for high schoolers, really hitting that explicit instruction, really focusing on the multiple representations. We had an example, I guess, 2 years ago where a 10th grader was having some difficulty with some geometry related to interior and exterior examples. And we brought in a geometry manipulative where they were actually like constructing their own shapes and then measuring that with a protractor. And the kids said that they don't remember the last time that they had touched something in math. And so, even though these are 16-year-olds, it doesn't mean that they don't need to be touching hands-on manipulatives or virtual manipulatives to be able to understand what the math actually means. So bringing in those multiple representations. And then another thing with high school is, what is the language? So how are you supporting students in terms of learning math vocabulary and those different things related to language? When it gets to high school and word problem solving, most of word problem solving is done through algebra. So really ensuring that students have a strong foundation in algebra is going to be really essential. And there are some algebra progress monitoring measures available. I know that Leanne Ketterling-Geller and her research team at SMU have some algebra progress monitoring measures, as do Ann Fagan and her research team at Iowa State. And so even though we didn't include those, showed specific examples of those in this math course, those are available. And so most of the framework stuff that we're talking about here really applies to high school in the same way that it applies to elementary school and middle school.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And if there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to ask. We did have another question that came in. This is what mathematics learning trajectories or learning progressions were used for the scope and sequence work?
So for the scope and sequence, we relied on we didn't rely on a single one, but our examples use the Common Core State Standards. So you'll see within Module 1 and some subsequent modules, you'll see the standards that are included in the Common Core, just because we wanted to find at least one set of standards that most states either know or adhere to. Now with the scope and sequencing, and this is the interesting part about this, is that we say, okay, here is the common trajectory for students, perhaps in place value learning, right? But then we mix it all up because this is intensive intervention. And so students may have a little bit of strengths in one of these areas and weaknesses in another. And so actually within the videos, you'll see how we place standards on top of each other, because this fluency standard is related to place value and this place value standard is related to word problem solving. But we really emphasize that for every student within intensive intervention, that is a different scope and sequence. And so while we might have some resources like those that are out there from like Achieve the Core that have these like nice little, you know, lineups along a math continuum of learning, for students in intensive intervention, we as teachers need to be very reflective and say, okay, I don't need to focus as much on that, but I do need to focus a lot here and here and here. And so with that scope of sequence, we use the Common Core state standards as kind of like, okay, this is our starting point, but now let's individualize it. And that's the whole thing that's different about intensive intervention that you would, that is different than what you would see in a tier 1 setting.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one of the questions that came in advance, and feel free for folks that are still online to go ahead and ask any questions. We have just a few minutes left to tap into Sarah's expertise, so feel free to ask those. Sarah, you talked a little bit about progress monitoring, diagnostic, those sorts of assessments. Do you have any recommendations around screening tools?
Well, I will turn every person to the NCII website with screening tools. So with screeners, most schools typically have something in place. And, you know, we're seeing everything in schools from like use of the map to use of iReady to like all kinds of things. Some schools will actually use their progress monitoring measures. So maybe schools are using AimsWeb or Dibble's Math. You can actually use like a small set of progress monitoring measures, perhaps like the first 3 that you administer, and those can actually also be used as a screener. So I would say too, I don't want to, I guess, say that one product is any better than the other, but you want a screening tool that's going to give you data across your school or your school district about how a single student is performing compared to students in that school or district and then students in a national sample. So that I can say, this student is performing at the 4th percentile nationally. I should have a lot of concern about this student and they should be involved in intensive intervention. So with any screener and any progress monitoring measure, I always want to ask, well, what's the normative data that you have that I can use to then help make smart decisions about these students? And then with diagnostics, diagnostics are typically, standardized assessments that we can use to understand how a student is performing in math. And the 3 that we're using in some of our research projects right now, which doesn't mean that they're the best, but they give us really good information, is that we use the TEMA, or the Test of Early Mathematics Ability, in the very early grades, so preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade. We use the KeyMath 3, which is really can be used across grades K through 12, but we usually use that across grades, 1 through 8, 1 through 7, and then in our project STAIR that I told you briefly about, we're using the DOMA, which is the Diagnostic Online Math Assessment, because that's transitioning to pre-algebraic and algebraic readiness. So, the key math has a little bit on algebra, but really we see algebra as like the most essential math skill for high schoolers to have proficiency with. So we transition to that as a diagnostic, and I think it provides diagnostic information in either 13 or 14 areas of pre-algebraic readiness. So those are some of the ones that we'll use within our research projects, and then also employ progress monitoring measures to ensure that students are making adequate progress.
Great. So can you just clarify one more time? We had one last minute kind of question. What did you say the diagnostics for K through 8 that you were just talking about?
We use the most often, we use the KeyMath 3. So it's a pretty popular one used in schools, but it measures students' math performance in 10 different areas. So it really gives you some nice deep analytics of how does the student perform with addition and subtraction, and how is that different from geometry, and how is that different from applied problem solving, right? So when you are trying to make those adaptations to intensive intervention within an intensive intervention framework, it's really important that your diagnostic gives you really detailed information about students' strengths and weaknesses. And then that goes back to that thing we were just talking about with the scope and sequence, right? So if I see that a student has weaker place value skill based on the diagnostic, then I'm going to amp up the place value instruction that we provide within intensive intervention.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. We are right at 4 o'clock.
You're welcome.
I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and thank you so much for this content. And folks, please feel free to visit the website, pass this information along to your colleagues. We're excited that all of you were able to join us and hope that you have a successful school year. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.